the explosion was not supposed to happen. It tore through the fog-covered forest at 0417 hours, a violent flash ripping apart the silence like a scream no one was ready for. Shards of steel and earth erupted skyward. For a heartbeat, everything froze, the ravaged trees, the startled birds, the men clutching their rifles, and time itself seemed to recoil from the blast. Then came the cries. Private Elias Mercer tasted blood on his tongue before he realized it wasn't his. Debris rained down around him. He stumbled backward, boots slick with mud, ears ringing. Something inside him, a whisper, a certainty, told him this was the moment everything began to unravel. "This can't be happening," Corporal Rains muttered, voice trembling. They were supposed to be invisible. Hidden. A reconnaissance squad sent ahead to quietly observe German troop movements near the Ardennes line. No engagement. No trace. No noise. One accidental trigger pull. One misfire. And the world changed. Elias forced himself upright, body shaking, heart hammering so violently he feared it would burst. Around him, scattered silhouettes emerged through the smoke, the men he trained beside, ate beside, joked with during long, frozen nights. Ordinary boys from farms, factories, and forgotten towns. Now, suddenly soldiers in a war too large to comprehend. Sergeant Harrow barked orders through the chaos. Form perimeter. Get low. Expect return fire. But there was no return fire. Not yet. Only silence. Thick, terrifying silence, heavy with the knowledge that someone, somewhere, now knew they were here. Elias scanned the tree-line. The fog shifted. And in that shifting veil he saw them, faint outlines, armored silhouettes, moving with terrible purpose. German infantry advancing silently through the mist like ghosts made of steel. There was still time to retreat. Still a chance to vanish. But fate had already chosen its path. Rains whispered, "They'll slaughter us." Elias felt the weight of that truth pressing down on his chest. His trembling fingers clutched his rifle. He was 19. He had never fired in combat. He was not ready to kill. Harrow looked at each man, eyes fierce, jaw set, with an expression that seemed to acknowledge something impossible. Something unforgivable. "They know we're here," the sergeant murmured. "If we run, they'll track us. Radio command. They'll compromise the entire flank. So what do we do?" Rains choked. Harrow inhaled. Slow. Heavy. "We hold." Elias felt his stomach drop. A simple command, but one that sealed their fate. A handful of men, alone in the forest, facing an enemy far greater in number. The Germans emerged fully from the mist, dozens of soldiers stepping carefully across the broken earth. Rifles raised. Expressionless behind cold eyes and colder helmets. A shot rang out. Then another. Then a storm of bullets screamed through the trees. Elias fired without thinking, shoulder jolting from the recoil. He saw a silhouette fall. Was it real? Did he kill someone? The thought tore through him violently. He did not want to kill. But he wanted to survive. The firefight raged. Bark exploded from trees like shrapnel. Men dove into muddy craters. The squad held formation, firing in bursts, determined to buy time, seconds, minutes, anything, for command to reposition. Screams echoed, German and American alike. The forest became a sanctuary for death, roots drinking the blood spilled above. Elias crawled between fallen branches toward Rains, who clutched his shoulder, bleeding. "I'm hit," Rains gasped. Elias pressed down, hands slick with crimson. "Stay with me." Artillery thundered in the distance. Not theirs. The Germans were calling in support. Time was running out. Harrow's voice pierced through gunfire, "We're sending Mercer." "Elias. You will flank right, reach the hilltop bunker, and signal artillery to fire coordinates." Elias was stunned. He wasn't the fastest. Not the strongest. Not the bravest. Yet Harrow saw something in his shaking limbs, wild eyes, and clenched jaw. A spark. He swallowed fear. "Yes, sir." Rains gripped his sleeve weakly. "Come back. Don't leave me here." Elias hesitated, but necessity overwhelmed friendship. He whispered, "I'll return," though doubt knifed his heart. He sprinted through the trees as bullets shredded bark beside him. Breath burning his lungs. Tears streaming from wind and smoke. The forest roared behind him, fading into distant chaos. He stumbled over roots, blood pounding in his ears, body driven by instinct more than courage. He wasn't a hero. He was a terrified boy with a desperate mission. Ahead, through swirling fog, the hill rose, a shadowed shape crowned with crumbling bunker walls. A relic of past battles, forgotten and silent. Lightning streaked across the sky, not from nature, but artillery fire in the distance, illuminating the path like a cruel omen. Elias forced himself onward. One man. Against time. Against fate. And in that moment, unknown to him, his footsteps through the mud began the story later whispered through history, of the soldiers who became legends. Elias Mercer emerged from the dense fog onto the crest of the hill, lungs burning, hands slick with mud and sweat. The bunker loomed before him, a decaying skeleton of concrete and steel, scarred by decades of forgotten battles. Its windows were shattered, walls cracked, graffiti etched from soldiers long gone. And yet, in the heart of that ruin, he felt a strange pulse, an echo of history waiting to reveal itself. He knelt beside the bunker's entrance, scanning the horizon. Through the mist, the forest seemed endless, a gray sea dotted with skeletal trees, each one trembling as though shivering from the chaos that had just passed. But something moved inside the bunker. A small metallic glint caught his eye, a German map case, abandoned, its leather scuffed, straps broken. Elias's fingers shook as he pried it open. Inside lay a map of the surrounding Ardennes terrain, but this was no ordinary military document. Coordinates were marked with precision, a network of roads, forest paths, and small villages highlighted. Scribbled notes in German revealed troop positions, movements, and, most shocking, a notation of a secret corridor, an unguarded path through which the Germans planned to launch a surprise attack at dawn. The revelation froze Elias. The squad had stumbled into a larger operation, one far beyond their understanding. The map was a key to both survival and catastrophe. If he acted, they could alert their commanders and potentially stop a deadly offensive. But any misstep could mean annihilation, not just for him, but for the rest of his men. His thoughts raced. Harrow's voice echoed in his mind, "We hold. Protect the flank. Protect the mission." But now the mission had shifted. This was no longer reconnaissance. It was a moral choice, a gambit that weighed every life in his hands. Suddenly, a low moan drew him from his contemplation. A wounded German soldier, barely alive, lay slumped against the bunker wall. His uniform was torn, dirt clinging to open wounds. Elias froze, gun ready, pulse hammering. The man's lips moved, whispering in broken English, "They, coming, silent corridor," the words struck like lightning. The secret wasn't just on the map, someone had survived the first wave to warn them. Elias realized that this was his chance, not merely to survive, but to prevent a massacre. He ran back down the hill, heart hammering with urgency. Every step reminded him of the men waiting behind, the chaos that could erupt in a heartbeat. He imagined Harrow and Rains, eyes wide with fear, counting on him to make a decision faster than any training could prepare him for. Elias reached a tree line, paused, and pulled out a field radio from his pack. His fingers fumbled over the buttons, hands slick, nerves taut. He tried the frequencies Harrow had marked, hoping desperately to reach artillery command. Static answered first. Then, finally, a crackling voice. "This is Lieutenant Caro, forward artillery. State your position and request." Elias's mind raced, weighing the coordinates. To call the strike on the German advance meant risking their own squad's exposure. Hesitation was fatal. He pressed the map into the radio case, double-checked the grid, and transmitted. The reply came, coordinates confirmed. Firing in 10 seconds. Stand by. A distant rumble began to rise in the valley below. The sound vibrated through the soles of Elias's boots, into his chest. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down, the enormity of the potential consequences. And then, the explosions began. Artillery shells screamed across the forest, tearing into the enemy lines with violent precision. Trees shuddered, bodies fell, and the once silent corridor erupted into chaos. Elias pressed himself against a rock, trying not to imagine the destruction, trying not to hear the screams. Minutes passed like hours. When the dust finally began to settle, Elias peered through the trees. German forces were retreating in disarray, soldiers scattering into the fog. But his victory came at a cost. Behind him, he glimpsed shadows among the trees, his own squad, battered but alive. Relief surged, mingled with guilt. Corporal Rains limped toward him, grimacing, but eyes wide with gratitude. "You saved us," he rasped. Elias shook his head. "No, we survived. That's all." Yet even in that brief moment of triumph, he felt the haunting weight of choices made under fire. Lives had been lost, both friend and foe, and there was no one to record the nuanced horror of what had just transpired. This was the silent truth of war, heroism and horror inseparable, each feeding the other. Night fell across the Ardennes, and the forest seemed to sigh. Shadows deepened, whispers of the dead threading through the branches. Elias and Rains returned to the battered perimeter, joining Harrow and the others. Together, they tended wounds, fortified positions, and tried to make sense of the impossible. A quiet determination settled over Elias. He would not allow this moment, these men, their bravery, to vanish into obscurity. These ordinary soldiers had done extraordinary things. And in that realization, he began to understand the first lesson of legend: it is not fame, but survival and courage in the face of impossible odds, that defines it. The night was long, and the fog heavy. But for the first time, Elias felt something stir, a spark of purpose beyond fear. They had survived the first wave, but the war was far from over. Somewhere in the distance, a lone owl called, and Elias imagined it as a herald, an omen, or perhaps a witness. He knew this story, his story, had only begun. And as the first faint light of dawn crept over the hill, he vowed silently, no matter the cost, no ordinary soldier would be forgotten. The forest was quiet again, but the silence was deceptive. Smoke from the distant artillery fire hung in the trees like a phantom, drifting and curling through the air. Elias Mercer crouched behind a fallen oak, fingers trembling as he pressed the mud-caked radio against his ear. The echoes of the previous night's chaos still pulsed in his chest, a heartbeat too fast, too loud. The artillery had done its job. The German advance was broken. The silent corridor had been destroyed before it could claim countless lives. And yet, victory came with a price heavier than any rifle could carry. Through the fog and smoke, Elias had glimpsed men, friend and foe alike, torn down by the shellfire. A young German soldier, barely out of boyhood, had fallen mere yards from him, eyes wide with terror. The image would haunt him forever. Corporal Rains staggered into view, leaning heavily on a broken branch. His uniform was torn, one sleeve stained dark with blood, but the glint of relief in his eyes betrayed a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. You saved us, Mercer," he rasped. "All of us." Elias shook his head. "We survived. That's all that matters." But it wasn't the whole truth. In the deep recesses of his mind, Elias knew that he had changed. He had been forced to make a choice: fire the artillery and save some. Potentially kill others. The burden of that decision weighed like iron around his chest, a reminder that heroism was never clean. Sergeant Harrow approached, his boots crunching over broken branches. His expression was unreadable, his eyes shadowed by fatigue and thought. He stopped beside Elias and laid a hand on his shoulder. "You did what needed to be done," he said quietly. "The squad, the flank, they're intact. You made the call." Elias met his gaze. "But the Germans? The ones we didn't see?" The ones who were surrendering. Harrow's jaw tightened. War isn't about comfort, boy. It's about survival and duty. Don't let guilt blind you. Elias wanted to protest, to argue that morality had a place even in the chaos of battle, but words caught in his throat. He had fired artillery that tore lives apart. He had changed the course of a battle. And for that, he would never be the same. The squad regrouped at the edge of the forest, assessing the aftermath. Broken bodies and shattered trees littered the clearing. A smell of smoke and gunpowder hung thick in the air. Harrow scanned the horizon, noting that German forces were retreating but regrouping farther along the line. "We can't stay here," he said. "We move toward the next objective. We've delayed them, yes, but the offensive isn't over. And we've seen what they're willing to do." Elias glanced at the map he had found the night before, now folded and tucked into his pack. The coordinates marked the next likely movement of the German troops, the path toward the villages farther east. They would need to be stopped again, or at least observed. As they moved, the forest seemed to close in around them, shadows stretching like dark fingers. The men were silent, each lost in their own thoughts, the gravity of their recent actions pressing upon them. Elias walked beside Rains, trying to find words, but none felt adequate. Instead, they moved in a shared, unspoken understanding. They had survived, and survival demanded action, even when the cost was unbearable. Hours later, they reached a small clearing near a ruined farmhouse. The building had been partially shelled, walls blackened by fire, windows shattered. Inside, they found supplies, canned food, blankets, and a few rifles left by retreating German soldiers. It was a small mercy, a temporary reprieve, but it reminded Elias of the precarious balance between life and death. Night fell once again, colder and darker than the previous evening. Around a dim fire, the squad gathered, tending wounds and sharing sparse rations. The silence was broken only by the crackling flames and distant artillery echoes. Elias sat apart, staring at the map. He traced the lines with a trembling finger, imagining the lives that would be affected by each movement. The secret corridor, now destroyed, had been a ticking time bomb. But the war was far from over. He realized that this was only the beginning of a larger story, one that would test every ounce of courage, judgment, and humanity he possessed. Corporal Rains broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder if we're the lucky ones? Or if we're just survivors?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He watched the firelight dance across the soldier's face, seeing both the boy he had once been and the hardened figure he was becoming. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Maybe we're both survivors and witnesses." Their conversation was interrupted by a distant sound, a muffled explosion, far but unmistakable. The German advance continued, relentless and methodical. Harrow stood, scanning the darkness. "We move at first light. Rest while you can. There's more to do." Elias lay down on the cold ground, blanket pulled tight around him, and stared at the stars peeking through the tree canopy. He thought of the lives lost, the choices made, and the path ahead. Somewhere in the haze of memory and smoke, a spark of purpose burned. They had been ordinary soldiers. And now, through impossible circumstances, they were being forged into legends. The dawn would bring more decisions, more fire, more loss. But for the first time, Elias felt a sense of clarity amidst the chaos. Heroism wasn't about recognition or glory, it was about the courage to act when every choice was terrible, when every outcome carried consequences heavier than words could express. As the forest slowly brightened with the first light of day, Elias folded the map and tucked it safely into his pack. He looked toward the east, where the German forces would strike next. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, but it no longer crushed him. He would face the coming day, the next battle, the moral abyss, and he would survive. Not for fame, not for glory, but for the men beside him, for the innocents who could be saved, and for the chance that ordinary soldiers might indeed become legends. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the ruined farmhouse, the first whispers of the squad's story began to form, a tale that history might one day hear, if only it survived long enough to be told. Dawn broke pale and gray over the Ardennes, mist curling around the blackened trees like spectral fingers. The squad moved cautiously, each step measured, every rustle of leaves a potential warning. Elias led the way, eyes sharp, heart still thrumming from the previous night's choices. The forest was eerily quiet now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the next act of this deadly theater. Harrow, limping slightly from a graze along his leg, kept a watchful eye on their flanks. Rains walked beside Elias, still pale from exhaustion but determined, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. Every man understood that they had survived the first chaos, but survival was no longer the only goal. They had to act, and the stakes were higher than ever. The captured map weighed heavily in Elias's pack. It was their guide, their only advantage, and a reminder of the lives depending on them. As they neared a small clearing, the faint outline of a ruined village emerged. The buildings were shattered, roofs gaping like broken teeth. Smoke curled from what remained of chimneys. The village, once vibrant, now stood as a mute testament to war's cruelty. Inside the village, they encountered the aftermath of a German advance, equipment abandoned in haste, blood-stained clothing, and the faint moan of the wounded hidden among the rubble. Elias motioned the men to stay low. Every shadow could conceal a hidden enemy. Every step could be the difference between life and death. As they navigated through the debris, Elias noticed a small, half-collapsed building tucked at the village's edge. He crept toward it, peering inside. A German officer, wounded but conscious, lay against the wall. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but filled with a quiet resignation. Elias approached cautiously, rifle raised. The man's voice was weak but clear. You must warn the others." Silent corridor, bigger plan, Elias felt the weight of the words. This was more than just a local operation, it was part of a coordinated offensive, a move that could change the outcome of the larger battle if left unchecked. Every second they lingered here increased the risk for themselves and for countless others. Harrow stepped forward, his presence authoritative. "We're listening. Speak clearly. Every detail matters." The officer coughed, blood staining his lips, but continued. They will advance at dawn. Unseen paths, radio towers, coordinate strike, destroy, or we all fall." Elias's mind raced. This was their next mission, not just survival, but sabotage. The squad would need to infiltrate enemy territory, disable communications, and prevent a catastrophic advance. It was a task that would test every ounce of skill, courage, and morality they possessed. By the way, if you're clinging to this moment with me, make sure to hit subscribe, more waits just ahead. Returning to the forest, Elias gathered the men around a smoldering fire, using its warmth to discuss strategy. The plan was risky, they would need to split into two teams. One would stay to guard the perimeter and tend to the wounded, the other, led by Elias and Rains, would move under cover of night to destroy the radio towers identified on the map. Fear flickered across the men's faces. None had planned to become saboteurs. None had expected to carry out a mission deep within enemy lines. But they were soldiers now, and ordinary soldiers were about to become legends. Nightfall came, and with it, a shadowed journey through the forest. The squad moved silently, stepping over roots and fallen branches, weaving through the darkness like ghosts. Elias felt every nerve in his body alert, every sense sharpened by adrenaline and fear. The woods seemed alive, whispering secrets and threats alike. They reached the first tower, its skeletal metal frame looming against the moonlit sky. Elias crouched beside it, examining the structure and the faint hum of electricity. With careful precision, the men set explosives, fingers trembling as they worked against time and the threat of discovery. The forest held its breath once more, a silent witness to their audacity. Explosions shattered the night, sending sparks into the sky and a shockwave through the surrounding trees. The radio tower collapsed in a fiery plume, signaling the first victory in a chain of critical actions that could thwart the German advance. Elias's heart surged, not with triumph, but with the knowledge that every success carried its own shadow of loss. Rains clapped him on the shoulder, whispering, "We're doing it. We're actually doing it." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and the strange exhilaration of victory. The forest seemed to exhale around them as they melted back into its cover, moving toward the next objective with silent determination. Each step was a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the bond that had formed among men who had been thrust into legend. The night stretched long, and the squad moved with careful efficiency, leaving no trace of their presence. They disabled the second tower, cut lines, and destroyed supplies. Every action was calculated, every risk measured. They were ordinary soldiers performing extraordinary feats, driven by duty, fear, and the unspoken understanding that the lives of countless others depended on their success. By the time the first light of dawn tinged the sky with gray, the mission was complete. The squad regrouped in a hidden clearing, exhausted but alive. Elias looked at each man, sweat-streaked faces, bloodied hands, eyes wide with the shared knowledge that they had altered the course of events in ways history might never record. Harrow approached, nodding in quiet approval. "You did well. All of you. Remember this moment. The choices you make now echo far beyond the forest." Elias felt a strange mix of pride and unease. They had succeeded, but the war was far from over. Each step forward would demand more courage, more sacrifice, and more confrontation with the moral complexities of combat. Yet, in this night's success, the first seeds of legend had taken root. The forest remained silent as the squad pressed onward, the smoke and echoes of battle fading into the distance. Ordinary men had become extraordinary by necessity. And in the quiet after the flames, Elias understood that the true measure of a soldier was not in medals or recognition, but in the courage to act when the world demanded the impossible. As dawn broke fully, illuminating the path ahead, Elias led the squad forward with steady resolve. The forest, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now seemed to embrace their passage, as if acknowledging the transformation that had begun. They were no longer just survivors, they were participants in a story that would ripple through time, a narrative of ordinary soldiers who dared to defy fate, embodying the quiet heroism that defines legend. The forest seemed endless, dark and oppressive, as Elias Mercer led his small squad deeper into enemy territory. The map had guided them through shadows and thickets, but each step now carried the weight of both fear and responsibility. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, could announce their presence to German patrols lying in wait. Rains moved beside Elias, eyes scanning the forest with unwavering focus. He was quieter now, more reflective, but the determination in his gaze was unmistakable. This mission was no longer just survival, it was offensive. They would strike at the heart of the German communication network, radio towers that coordinated attacks, supply routes, and reinforcements. "Remember," Elias whispered, crouched behind a fallen log, "silence is our weapon. We move fast, strike hard, and vanish before they even know we were here." Harrow had insisted that only a handful of men undertake this mission. The rest of the squad would hold the perimeter, tending to wounded and ensuring that their operations in the forest remained undetected. Elias felt the weight of leadership settle upon him. Harrow had survived long enough to train them, but now the mantle of decision-making rested squarely on Elias's shoulders. The first tower appeared at the edge of a clearing, skeletal and imposing, wires humming faintly in the cold night air. Elias gestured for the squad to split into two teams. He and Rains would ascend the tower, planting explosives at the base, while the others circled to guard the perimeter. As they approached, the crunch of gravel beneath boots betrayed their presence. Shadows moved in the periphery, German patrols, silent, lethal, unaware of the approaching danger. Elias's heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears like distant gunfire. "Ready?" Rains whispered. Elias nodded, fingers tight around the detonator. "Let's finish this." Climbing the tower was perilous. Rusted metal groaned under their weight, sending shivers through the squad. Every movement had to be precise, a misstep could trigger an alarm or collapse the structure entirely. When they reached the base, Elias set the charges with meticulous care, checking the timer twice. From the perimeter, Harrow signaled that the coast was clear. Elias and Rains slipped back into the shadows, retreating with the stealth of hunters. The first explosion shook the night, throwing sparks and metal into the sky. The tower crumpled in a shower of fire and smoke, severing communications across the enemy line. But triumph was short-lived. A German soldier, previously hidden, emerged from the forest, raising his rifle. A single shot rang out, Harrow's warning from the perimeter. Bullets tore through the night as chaos erupted. Rain's dove, dragging Elias behind a fallen tree, both of them hearts hammering in tandem with the gunfire. In the chaos, Harrow took a bullet to the chest. Elias watched in horror as the man who had guided him, trained him, and believed in him fell to the ground, blood soaking into his uniform. Harrow's hand reached out, gripping Elias's sleeve. Lead them home," he whispered before losing consciousness. The squad retreated, carrying Harrow with them. They vanished into the forest under a canopy of darkness, guided only by the faint moonlight and their own determination. Harrow's injury was grave, and Elias understood the cruel truth: he had to assume full command. Rains spoke, voice trembling. "We can't leave him here." We can't, we won't," Elias interrupted firmly. "We move, we survive, we finish what we came to do. And we save him if we can." The forest seemed endless as they navigated through the night, every shadow a threat, every sound a warning. Elias's mind raced with strategy: how to continue the mission, protect his men, and honor Harrow's trust. Each decision was a gamble, each choice a test of courage. They reached a second tower, equally vital. The operation had to succeed. Failure would allow the Germans to regroup, potentially overrunning Allied positions and costing countless lives. Elias directed the men with calm authority, planting charges and setting timers while Rains covered the perimeter. Sweat stung his eyes, muscles burned, but he moved with the precision of someone who understood the stakes. Once the second tower collapsed, the squad regrouped. Their success was undeniable, but so were the losses. Harrow remained unconscious, and the forest, once a place of potential cover, now felt like a cage of shadows and dangers. As dawn approached, Elias gathered the men around a small fire hidden in the ruins of an abandoned farmhouse. They were battered, exhausted, and haunted by what they had witnessed. Rains tended to Harrow's wounds with trembling hands, doing what little he could. This is bigger than us," Elias whispered, staring into the flames. "But we're still here. We're still breathing. And that counts for something." Rains nodded silently, tears streaking his dirt-stained face. Around them, the forest seemed to exhale, a brief reprieve before the next wave of danger. Each man understood the truth: they had stepped into the heart of the enemy, faced impossible odds, and survived. They were no longer ordinary soldiers. They were legends in the making. Night faded into a gray morning. The squad, weary but resolute, moved onward, carrying Harrow between them, navigating a path through the ruins of war-torn villages. Every step forward was a triumph over fear, fatigue, and the haunting knowledge of lives lost and changed forever. Elias felt a strange clarity in the early light. Leadership was no longer a title, it was a responsibility, a burden, and a test of character. The mission would continue, danger would continue, and the forest would continue to demand more than they could ever imagine. Yet, in the quiet moments, in the shared glances and unspoken understanding among the men, Elias recognized the truth: they were transforming, becoming something greater than themselves. And in that realization, a spark of hope ignited amidst the shadows. For ordinary soldiers had now stepped into the realm of legend. The forest had witnessed their courage. The enemy had felt their impact. And history, even if it forgot the names, would remember the acts, the bravery, the sacrifices, the impossible choices that had turned boys into heroes. The ruined village lay silent under a cold, gray dawn. Smoke curled from crumbling chimneys, mingling with the mist, and the remnants of shattered buildings cast long shadows across the frost-laden ground. Elias Mercer and his squad huddled behind broken walls, exhausted, bloodied, and aware that they had walked into the teeth of the enemy's plan. The night had been merciless, the forest a labyrinth of danger, but the day ahead promised even greater trials. Harrow's condition remained critical. Rains worked tirelessly to stabilize him, wrapping torn uniforms around wounds, pressing gauze where bullets had ripped through flesh. Yet each movement was slower than the last, his face etched with fatigue and fear. Elias realized that Harrow's survival depended on their mission's success, and on the courage of men who had already been pushed beyond the limits of ordinary endurance. Through the mist, distant movements signaled the approaching German forces. They had tracked the squad after the previous night's sabotage, and now the hunters had become the hunted. Elias crouched beside Rains, whispering commands. Positions. Hold. Don't fire until I say. His words were calm, but inside, his heart hammered like war drums. The enemy advanced with precision, surrounding the village's outer edges. There was no cover, only shattered walls and the skeletal remains of buildings. Every step forward could be the last, every breath could betray them. Elias's mind raced. Ammunition was low. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet survival demanded action. The first shot rang out, a warning, or perhaps the beginning of total chaos. Bullets tore through timber and brick, ricocheting across the empty streets. Elias fired in short, precise bursts, each shot a defiance against overwhelming odds. Rains flanked the left side, taking careful aim at advancing soldiers. The air was thick with smoke, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of fear. Hours passed in a blur of motion, pain, and strategy. The squad's position was precarious, each man fought not only for survival, but to protect the wounded Harrow. Every time a German soldier fell, Elias felt a mix of relief and guilt. Victory was necessary, but the cost was etched into every face he saw, into every trembling hand and strained breath. The villagers' ruins offered few advantages, yet Elias used the environment to their benefit. Collapsed walls became barricades, shattered roofs provided cover, and alleyways channeled enemy movements into predictable paths. Strategy became instinct. Each ordinary soldier became extraordinary, performing feats of courage that defied probability. As dusk approached, a new wave of enemy reinforcements appeared. Elias knew that without intervention, they would be overrun. He rallied his men, voice steady, eyes burning with determination. Hold the line. For every life here, we fight. For every brother beside you, we fight. The men responded, not as boys from distant towns, but as warriors forged in fire. Ordinary soldiers became unyielding defenders, moving with synchronized precision, striking where needed, covering each other's flanks. Their courage inspired one another, transforming fear into lethal resolve. Amid the chaos, Rains carried Harrow to a more secure position, exposing himself to enemy fire. A bullet struck him, and he fell. Elias's world narrowed to a single point, the fallen comrade, the wounded sergeant, the approaching enemy. Adrenaline surged. He charged forward, dragging Rains to cover while firing with unrelenting focus. By midnight, the village was a war zone. Bodies and debris littered the streets, yet the squad's hold remained unbroken. Reinforcements finally arrived, a column of Allied soldiers moving through the forest, alerted by signals Elias had managed to send earlier. Their arrival was decisive, turning the tide against the exhausted German forces. Elias and the remaining men watched as the enemy retreated, shadows disappearing into the forest. Silence fell again, heavy and complete, punctuated only by groans of the wounded and the crackling of makeshift fires. They were victorious, but victory was not without sacrifice. Rains, gravely wounded, had delivered the final message that had ensured reinforcements knew their exact location. Harrow survived, but barely, and the forest itself seemed to mourn the lives lost in the struggle. Elias sat among the rubble, bloodied, bruised, and exhausted, but filled with a profound understanding. Ordinary men, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, had risen to the challenge. Their courage, ingenuity, and unwavering commitment to one another had created legends. These acts would never appear in headlines or history books, yet they were no less monumental. He gazed at the faces of the surviving men, each scar, each tear, each trembling smile a testament to the trials they had endured. They had faced impossible odds, confronted the moral complexities of war, and emerged with their humanity intact. In those moments, Elias realized that legends were not born, they were forged in the crucible of choice, fear, and unwavering courage. As dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the village in pale light, Elias rose. He helped Rains and Harrow to their feet, guiding them through the streets littered with memories of combat. Ordinary soldiers had walked into hell, and through bravery and sacrifice, had emerged as guardians of a story that might otherwise have been lost. The forest beyond awaited, still dark and quiet, but Elias felt a spark of purpose. They had survived, they had acted, and they had defined heroism on their own terms. Each man carried wounds, visible and invisible, but they also carried a legacy. In that long night of fire, bullets, and blood, ordinary soldiers had become legends. And though history might forget their names, their deeds, etched into the memory of those who survived, would endure. The war was over, but the echoes of its chaos lingered in Elias Mercer's mind like shadows refusing to leave. The forest, the ruined villages, the screams of the fallen, they were all imprinted on him, indelible as scars. He had returned home, yet home felt foreign, a place where laughter and light existed only in fragments of memory. The ordinary boy who had left was gone, replaced by a man who had faced death, moral dilemmas, and the unimaginable weight of responsibility. Elias walked the familiar streets of his hometown, each corner a reminder of what he had left behind and what he had become. He saw neighbors and friends, unaware of the horrors he had witnessed, the lives he had saved, and the comrades he had lost. The medals awarded to some were meaningless compared to the truths etched in his heart, Rains's courage, Harrow's guidance, and the sacrifices of every man in his squad. Ordinary soldiers had acted beyond ordinary limits, yet history had largely forgotten them. He visited families of fallen comrades, sharing stories that had never been recorded in books or newspapers. A mother who had lost her son listened with tear-streaked cheeks as Elias described how he had held his friend's hand in the dark, whispering courage when fear threatened to consume them. A father learned that his boy had helped disable enemy radio towers, a small but pivotal act that prevented a larger catastrophe. These stories were fragile, oral threads connecting memory to history, ensuring that even if the world forgot, someone would remember. Elias grappled with guilt. Survivors often did. He remembered Rains, dying in the forest with a look of fierce determination and quiet acceptance, delivering the last message that had saved countless lives. He remembered Harrow, wounded yet defiant, entrusting leadership to a boy who had never asked for such a burden. He remembered the artillery strike, the moral choices, the men who had fallen under the smoke and trees. These memories weighed heavily, a constant companion, a reminder that heroism was inseparable from suffering. Yet, alongside grief, there was pride. He had witnessed ordinary soldiers become extraordinary, not because of fame, medals, or recognition, but because of courage, ingenuity, and an unwavering commitment to each other. They had faced impossible odds and had acted when no one else could. Their deeds, though unwritten, had shaped the course of battles, saved lives, and demonstrated the profound truth that history is often defined by those who operate in silence, unseen. Elias took up a pen and began writing. He filled notebooks with names, actions, and moments that could not be allowed to fade. Every detail mattered: the night they discovered the secret map, the artillery strike that saved a flank, the sabotage of enemy towers, the long hours of vigilance in forests and ruined villages, and the final standoff that had turned ordinary soldiers into legends. His words preserved the essence of courage, sacrifice, and humanity amid the horrors of war. The process of writing was cathartic. Each sentence allowed him to confront fear, grief, and guilt, transforming them into a narrative that honored the men who had stood beside him. He wrote not for recognition or glory, but for truth. Ordinary soldiers had become legends through choice, action, and moral courage. If no one else remembered, at least he would. He also understood that heroism often goes unnoticed. The world remembers generals and campaigns, battles and victories, but not the small squads in forests and villages, the quiet acts of bravery, the moral choices made under fire. Elias vowed to change that, to ensure that the sacrifices of his comrades were never truly forgotten, and that the story of ordinary soldiers who became legends would endure. Years later, Elias returned to the Ardennes forest, walking the paths once traversed under darkness and fear. The forest had changed, yet it still whispered the echoes of the past. He knelt at the site of the final stand, placing a small stone in memory of those who had fallen. In that quiet act, he felt a sense of closure. The forest held their story now, a silent testament to courage and sacrifice. He realized that legends are not measured by fame, medals, or history books, they are measured by the impact of courage, the bonds forged under fire, and the moral choices made when all options carry consequence. The ordinary soldiers of the Ardennes had transformed not because the world celebrated them, but because they had acted when others could not. Elias walked home through the early morning light, carrying with him the legacy of men who had faced the unimaginable and survived, changed forever. Their story, once hidden in shadows and fog, would live in the pages he wrote, in the memories he shared, and in the quiet knowledge that ordinary soldiers can indeed become legends. The war had ended, but the spirit of courage, sacrifice, and moral resolve endured. And though history might overlook the names, the deeds, the acts of heroism in forests, ruined villages, and under the weight of impossible choices, would remain eternal in the hearts of those who survived and those who remembered. Elias Mercer understood this fully. He had seen ordinary soldiers become legends. And in their legacy, he had found purpose, honor, and the unshakable truth that courage is timeless.